Imagine a world before kings, a land of scattered chiefs, rival clans, and halls filled with the smoke of endless feuds. Then, like a shadow rising against a wall of invasive Christian empires, came rulers who changed everything. Godfred of Denmark, Harald Fairhair of Norway, and the Phantom King that most people didn't know existed. These were not just men with crowns. They were the first to shape the Viking world into kingdoms, to push back against superpowers, and to turn stories into legacies that still echo today. In this episode, you'll uncover how the idea of the first Viking king, it's not so simple. It's a story told 3 ways. By the end, you'll know why Godfred terrified Charlemagne, why Harald vowed never to cut his hair until all of Norway bent to his rule, and why the legendary mystery king of the sagas takes the ultimate title of the first king of the Vikings. You're not going to want to miss the third and the final king that we talk about in this episode, because once you hear, you're going to know a lot more than the average Viking fan. You may even end up with a new view on who the actual first king of the Vikings was. This episode isn't just names and dates. It's the blueprint of Viking kingship and how myth and history forged power together. Most people think of Vikings as raiders without order, wild men with axes and ships. The problem, that picture leaves out the truth. The Vikings built kingdoms. They forged walls, laws, and crowns that reshaped Europe. If you only see the raids, you miss the rise of the kings themselves. Before Norway crowned Harald Fairhair, before the sagas sang of kings who ruled by oath and fire, there was Godfred, the first Viking king whose shadow stretched beyond his own shores. For centuries, the North had known only jarls and chieftains, men of one valley or one fjord, always feuding, never united. But the age of the scattered clans was ending. To the south, Charlemagne's empire rose like a hammer, pressing hard against the northern border. And when the storm gathered, the Danes found what they had never known before: a single king to bind them together. Godfred, he was the first, and he would not be the last. His reign was brief, but his shadow was long. To friend and foe alike, his name marked the moment when the Danes ceased to be tribes and began to be a kingdom. The old chronicles whispered his name like steel against stone. Godfred, king of the Danes. He was not just a small lord of one narrow fjord, not just master of a single hall of timber and smoke. He was something greater, stretching his reach across the windswept lands of Jutland. To the south, Charlemagne's empire rose like a giant in armor, a wall of iron pressing closer and closer each year. But on the far side of the swamp and the sea, Godfred stood tall, storm in his heart, fire in his eyes. The Frankish scribes wrote of him as a raider, a threat, a shadow creeping at their border. But to his people, he was the tide itself, gathering, rising, pulling them together for the first time. The Danes spoke of one king, not many chiefs forever at war with each other. Godfred bound them like links in a single chain, strong enough to strike, strong enough to withstand the iron will of Charlemagne. And so when he looked outward, across the marsh, across the water to the banners of Charlemagne snapping in the wind, he knew the world was changing. Kingdoms were swallowing kingdoms. Empires were eating whole nations like wolves with bones between their teeth. But Godfred swore it would not happen to the Danes. They would not be torn apart. And that's why he struck first. In 804, the quills of Charlemagne's scribes scratched his name into the annals with unease. Godfred, storm-browed, iron-hearted, stood at the Saxon border like thunder rolling down from the north. His raiders swept fast as falcons. His longships cut the water like blades. The empire to the south was so proud and so mighty, but it felt the tremor of power rising where they least expected it. By 808, his wrath came down on Frisia. The coast saw dragon-prowed ships slicing through the tides, sails swollen with northern wind. The villages shook beneath the sudden strike. Smoke curled to heaven. The Frisians, they were caught between fire and wave, and they bent the knee. Tribute was poured into Danish hands, silver, heavy and bright, all to buy the mercy of Godfred's fire. And still, he wasn't satisfied. He turned eastward to the lands of the Slavs, tribes standing between Dane and Frank. They thought themselves shielded by their border, safe in their forests, but Godfred's shadow stretched long. He pressed them down, pulled them into his grasp, and with every victory he showed the world something new. The Danes were no longer scattered, no longer clawing at each other like wolves over one bone. They were bound together, one chain, one storm, one kingdom. To the Franks, he was terror. To the Frisians, fire. To the Slavs, a weight that they could not lift. But to the Danes, he was the dream of what they could be. For the first time, they looked at their king and saw not a chieftain, not a man of one hall or one fjord, but a nation taking shape beneath his hand. Godfred was the first to make the South tremble at the name of the North. A king isn't only feared for the battles he fights. He's also feared for the things he builds. And Godfred built a wall. He turned his gaze south across Jutland, the land that points down toward the German tribes. There stretched a wall, a huge wall. It was not a small fence or just a ditch. It was the serpent of the earth made of stone, twisting across the land like a giant guarding its treasure. This wall, it was the spine of Denmark itself. Picture it, more than 18 miles of packed earth running across the narrow waste of Jutland, Denmark's southern peninsula. Its construction had started earlier, in the 600s. It was built by local chieftains over the years and slowly added on to, just enough to slow the enemy's march. But by Godfred's day, 2 centuries later, it had grown, and under his command, it became something greater still. His workers thickened the ramparts, heaped up the earth higher, and crowned it with tall timber walls sharp as a row of spears. At its feet, ditches, deep, dark cuts in the earth that forced any enemy attacker to stumble, a trap of mud and shadow. And from above, the Danish defenders could rain arrows, stone, or boiling pitch upon all who dared to approach. The wall stretched from the swamp to the forest, cutting across like a giant's arm. Some said it looked like the ribs of the earth. Others called it a sleeping dragon, silent, massive, and deadly if provoked. In Godfred's hand, he made it even stronger. While earlier chieftains and local rulers had raised portions of the wall, Godfred was the first to bind it together into one great shield. Under his command, this wall grew into the largest fortification of its kind in northern Europe. It was not only a defense, it was defiance. To the Franks, it said, "You're not going to break the north." And to the Danes, it said, "Here's your shield, and your kingdom is safe behind it." And the truth of it still remains. Even today, more than 1,000 years later, the wall still lies across the Danish countryside. Grass-covered mounds and ditches that still tell the tale of a wall that once held back empires. Archaeologists have uncovered layers upon layers of its history, showing how each generation built it higher, stronger, longer. What Godfred built in the early 800s still whispers from the earth. Here is the edge of the north. Cross it if you dare. Godfred had bound his people, not just by raids and victory, but by safety. He gave them a shield no sword could easily break. And for the first time, the Danes knew what it meant to be more than a tribe. They were a kingdom. They were sharp as iron, fierce as fire, and protected by a wall of their own making. The walls stood tall, and they guarded the border. They guarded the people. They guarded the dream of a Denmark that could stand as one. But there was one thing even the strongest walls can't guard a king from, and that is the shadows inside his own hall. By 810, Charlemagne's empire still watched, wary of the storm brewing in the north. Godfred had struck them with raids, walled them off with earthworks, forced them to reckon with a people who refused to bend. To the Danes, he was a living shield, a war leader, a king who had done what none before him dared. The people looked to him as iron, and he was unbreakable. And yet, it was not armies nor emperors that brought him down. It was closer, quieter, treachery at his own hearth. From the high seat, Godfred had looked on his kingdom with pride. The wall stood strong, the coasts bent to his ships. The tribes of Denmark, once quarrelsome, he had stood against the might of Charlemagne's empire, the greatest power Europe had seen since Rome. And he didn't break. To his people, he was proof that the Danes were no longer prey, but hunters. But as with all glory, shadows gather at its edges. Success is never without enemies. Some men would rather see a kingdom crumble than another man wear the crown. Some whisper, I could do it better. Why not me? Others dream, if I can't be king, then no one can. And so, from the shadows, a mystery emerged. A man, cloaked in black, nameless, faceless, waiting at the tree line beyond the hall. He watched as the torches faded, as mead made the strong stumble, as the laughter of jarls and warriors dulled into snores. He waited for the last plume of smoke to drift from the hearth and vanish into the rafters. Then, like a shadow slipping into the darkness, he moved. Through the hall doors, silent as a fox, past the thick wooden beams, past the benches where warriors, chieftains, jarls, and men who had bent their knees to Godfred slept heavy with drink. The assassin carried no sword of honor, no shield to bear, only a knife. Blackened steel meant not for battle, but for silence. And there, at the king's bench, he stopped. Godfred, the storm of the north, lay at rest. His chest rose and fell, his face at peace. The assassin knelt, and with a swift motion, one hand covered the king's mouth, the other struck quick, cruel, unhesitating, a single deep cut across the throat. Godfred's eyes flew open. For a heartbeat, the king stared into the face of his betrayer. He tried to lift his hand to raise to fight, but his strength rushed from him like water from a broken vessel. He sank back upon the bench, still as he had been a moment before, only now, no breath remained. The deed was done. The assassin slipped out the way he came. Into the night, into the forest, into the nameless silence of history. No one knew who he was. No one knew where he came from or even why. But when morning came and the Danes found their king lifeless, the hall shook with grief and fury. The first true king of the north was gone, not felled by an emperor's sword, but by the serpent at his own hearth. And the Danes, once bound by his hand, were left staring into the abyss, no leader to guide them, no shield to hold them. And to the south, Charlemagne's empire waited, its armies knocking like a hammer against the doors of the north. The Frankish scribes leave us only fragments, a blade, a shadow, the whisper of betrayal. Some say it was a rival line hungry for power. Some say it was a member of his own household, a man who had feasted at his table maybe. Whatever the truth, no clash of arms marked Godfred's end. No war cry echoed in the night, only silence, sudden and sharp. For the Danes, it must have been like waking to find the sun gone from the sky. A kingdom bound together by one man's will, now staring into uncertainty. And yet, death could not erase him. In the ink of the Franks, his name endures. The first Viking king to make emperors grind their teeth. To his enemies, he was terror. To his people, he was the shape of what was to come. And though his body was laid in the earth, the echo of Godfred rose again and again in the kings that followed. Men who carried fire to England, to Francia, to the far edges of the known world. Godfred was the first shadow on Christendom's wall, and he wouldn't be the last. Godfred was the first Viking king to truly make Christian Europe afraid. His power loomed over the south like a storm cloud. Charlemagne's empire, the Franks, they saw themselves as the great wall protecting Christian lands, and suddenly, on the far side of that wall stood Godfred. He was the first to unite the Danes into something more than raiders with axes and ships. Under him, Denmark became a kingdom strong enough to resist, strong enough to push back against the empire. To the Franks, Godfred was not just a name. He was a shadow, a dark shape on the horizon, creeping closer, threatening their borders. And when we say he wouldn't be the last, it's because Godfred's death didn't end the dream of kingship in the north. His shadow stretched forward into the sagas themselves, where other rulers rose to take the mantle. For Godfred had shown the way, that the tribes of the Norse, once fractured and feuding, could stand as one, and when they did, they became more than raiders. They became a storm that kingdoms could not ignore. To the east, the Slavs, they bent the knee to the Danish yoke. To the south, the Franks of Charlemagne learned that their borders were no longer safe. To the west, the coast of Frisia and Saxony, they felt the burn of Viking fire. Europe had thought the north was a wilderness, but Godfred proved it could be a kingdom, one that could raid, threaten, and even rival other empires. And so his death did not close a chapter. It opened a door for others to step through. Kings who dreamed even bigger, who sought not only to defend their homelands, but to rule the seas, islands, and nations far beyond. The next great name was Harald Fairhair of Norway, a man said to have bound his land with blood and battle, who swore an oath to never cut his hair until he wore the crown of a united Norway. When Godfred's shadow loomed over the south, Harald's ambition turned inward, towards the fjords themselves. He would be the one to forge Norway into a single realm, and in doing so, set the stage for the Vikings to strike deeper into the heart of Europe than ever before. The sagas tell us that before Harald became king, he was just the son of a petty ruler. His father ruled patches of southeastern Norway, small valleys and fjords held by sword and oath. It was a time when Norway was no single land, but a scatter of chieftains, each clinging to their hall like wolves over scraps. But Harald was not content with scraps. The story goes that a young woman caught his eye, and this young maiden mocked him, saying that she would never marry a man who only ruled a corner of Norway. Her words cut him deep, deeper than any blade. And so Harald swore a vow before his men that he'd never cut his hair or comb it until all of Norway bowed to him beneath one crown. And so his locks grew wild and tangled, a mane of fire and shadow, until at last the sagas say he earned the name Fairhair. When the land was his and his hair was washed, cut, and gleamed golden in the sun. That vow lit a fire in him. No longer would Norway be a patchwork of feuding jarls. No longer would raiders turn on each other while kingdoms to the south grew fat on unity. Harald would bind the fjords into one realm, and in doing so, give birth to the kingdom of Norway itself. Norway before Harald was a splintered land, broken like ice on the fjord in spring. Dozens of petty kings and jarls clutched their narrow valleys and sheltered coastlines, each ruling a handful of farms, a single fjord, or a mountain pass. They were proud men, fierce and jealous, raiding one another as often as they raided across the sea. Into this world is where Harald was born, son of a petty king of southeastern Norway. His father's name carried weight in the valleys, but not far beyond. Harald might have grown to be like all the others, lord of a patch of land, defender of a fjord, remembered only by his kin. But destiny, like the sea, has its own tide. The sagas tell us it was a woman who lit the spark. Her name was Gyda, a young woman of high social standing. When Harald sent message to her seeking her hand in marriage, she laughed, and she sent back her answer, "I will not give myself to a man who rules only a corner of Norway. If he would be king over the whole land, then perhaps I would think of him. Her words stung, but they didn't wound him. They sharpened him, and they gave him the vision he needed to do something no one thought was possible. Before his men, Harald swore an oath. He would not cut or comb his hair until he was the sole king of Norway. His locks grew wild, tangled, matted into clumps like seaweed tossed upon the shore. His warriors had all kinds of nicknames for him, and they continued until the day his vow was fulfilled and he cut his hair. Turns out, in the sun, his hair was extremely fair. From that day forward, he was known as Harald Fairhair. It was not just an oath of pride, it was a vision, and vision turns men into kings. Harald began his climb like a storm creeping down from the mountains, slow, gathering force, then sudden in its violence. He broke rival chiefs one by one, valley by valley, fjord by fjord. Some he crushed with sword and fire, others he bent with oath and silver. His army grew. His fleet spread like black wings over the coast until at last the smaller kings, they saw what was coming, and so they banded together. The great coalition of Norway's jarls and petty kings gathered their longships and raised their banners to break Harald once and for all. The clash came around the year 872 in a narrow fjord where the cliffs hemmed the sea like the jaws of a beast. The sagas say the battle raged with the fury of a storm at sea. Oars splintered, shields shattered, ships rammed until they locked together and the fighting spilled across their decks. Steel rang, arrows flew, men slipped on blood-slicked planks, and the air choked with smoke and spray. Harald's warriors pressed hard. Line after line of his enemies fell, their ships driven back against the rocks, their banners torn and cast down. One by one, the coalition broke. When the waves settled, the fjord belonged to Harald. That and every other waterway in Norway. From that day forward, no man in Norway could claim to be his equal. The land, once fractured, was bound together beneath his name. The sagas say it was after this epic battle that he washed his hair for the first time in 10 years. He cut it, let it flow long and golden, and the vow, it was complete. And what of Gyda, the maiden whose scorn had set the fire in his life? The tales tell us that Harald did win her once Norway was his. She became one among many wives. Like so many kings of his age, they measured wealth not only in silver and land, but in the women bound to their hall. Yet Gyda's words matter more than her place at his side. She had spoken a challenge, and Harald had answered it with steel, blood, and fire. The kingdom of Norway was not won by a kiss, but by a mocking vow that had lit a spark that set fire to a man who would consume all of Norway. So yeah, he got the girl, but more than that, Harald Fairhair was hailed as the first king of Norway and lives on in the annals of history. Yet to win a kingdom is one thing. To hold it is another. Harald now ruled a coast stretching hundreds of miles, from the southern tip of Norway to the far fjords of the north. He planted his estates like anchors along the shore, strongholds where his warriors could watch the land and his taxmen could gather the king's due. Norway, once wild, felt the grip of a single hand. Trade routes along the coast fell beneath his control. No ship could move from fjord to fjord without his say. And with trade came wealth. Silver from the east, furs from the north, grain and wine from the south. Harald's kingdom swelled like a chest so full of silver the lid couldn't close. But every greedy government soon finds out that its people can only take so much. The taxes weighed heavy. The freedom of the old jarls and chiefs was gone. Men who once ruled their valleys found themselves bent beneath the crown, and many did not bend quietly. The sagas whisper of how some chiefs and farmers unwilling to pay Harald's price took their families, their ships, and their goods, and they sailed west. They sailed across the sea. They went to the Faroe Islands, to Iceland, even further still to Greenland. There, they carved new homes from stone and ice, carrying Norway in their blood, but leaving Harald's heavy hand behind. Some cursed him for driving them away. Others blessed him for forcing them to seek new horizons. But either way, the world changed. The kingdom Harald forged at home sent ripples outward across the North Atlantic. What began for some as exile became expansion, and thus the very weight of Harald's rule helped shape the Viking migration that would mark the next few centuries of history. Harald Fairhair's saga stands at the meeting of legend and truth. Historians may argue where the story ends and the myth begins, but the fact remains, his name is remembered. He is the archetype of the unifying Viking king, the first to gather the harsh, fractured land of Norway and call it whole. For nearly 60 years, the sagas say he ruled. His hair grew long and bright, his halls filled with treasure, and his ships with warriors. In the end, age crept up on him as it does all men. Around the year 930, he died, leaving behind not just sons and heirs, but an idea that Norway could be one, and that idea has never died. When we speak of Harald Fairhair, we do not only speak of a man, but of a turning point. Before him, Norway was a patchwork quilt of chiefs and valleys. After him, it was a kingdom. However fragile, however bloody its birth, his shadow reached beyond his own time, echoed in the kings who followed, in the migrations to Iceland, into the great sea kings who would one day carve realms in Ireland, England, and beyond. He was not the first Viking king to wield a crown. That honor belongs to Godfred of Denmark. But he was the first to bind Norway, the first to make the fjord bend beneath a single name. Harald gave Norway its first crown, and Godfred before him had given Denmark its first taste of kingship. These were kings of record, stamped into the parchment of enemies and the memory of the North. But some say there was another, a figure who came even earlier, older than Godfred, older than Harald. His name drifts through the sagas like smoke through pine trees, half memory, half myth. The skalds whisper of a shadow who reached further than either Dane or Norwegian, who stretched his hands across Sweden, Denmark, and lands beyond, a king whose crown may never have gleamed in history's sun, but whose legend glows in the firelight of story. Could this be the first king to wield a crown, taking the honor that many believe belongs to Godfred of Denmark? The sagas place him at the dawn of the Viking Age, a time when Europe was still shaking off the dust of Rome. They say he was the grandson of a Swedish ruler, the heir of a bloodline meant for greatness. But the truth of Ivar Vidfane is uncertain. He is not found in the chronicles of the Franks or Saxons, nor in the careful ink of Christian monks. He survives instead in the sagas and in the songs of Iceland told centuries later. And what they say is this: Ivar Vidfane was a king whose reach stretched further than any before him. His ships cut across the coast, his warriors thundered over lands, and his shadow darkened more than one throne. He was the kind of ruler who made kingdoms tremble, and perhaps even made men like Godfred and Harald pale in comparison. The sagas hand him a kingdom that feels a little more like a dream than a map. They say Sweden bent to him, Denmark bowed to him, Norway, Saxony, yes, and even whispers of England and Ireland. They all felt the weight of his rule. That is why they called him Vindfane, the wide embracer. His arms stretched wide over the north, as though all of Scandinavia and beyond lay inside his grasp. In the sagas, Ivar is remembered less for a single battle than for his sweeping conquest. The storytellers spoke of him defeating rival rulers in Sweden and Denmark, breaking them like twigs beneath his boot, until no petty king could stand against him. But the truth is, There's no Frankish scribe that mentions his name in their records. No runestone was carved in his honor. To some, that makes him a phantom, an echo of a king invented to give weight to the sagas or to explain how later rulers claimed their crowns. Yet, even a phantom can carry fire, and Ivar's legend burned bright enough that centuries later men still whispered of him. As with so many saga kings, the higher the rise to power, the stranger the fall from glory. They say omens gathered around him, ravens circling in the sky, dreams twisting sour in the night, and then came some sort of betrayal, a trick. One claim says that he was tricked into riding his horse off a cliff, dashed by jagged stones below, not by the clash of swords, but by fate itself. And fate, as we know, is a tricky thing in Norse mythology. So who was Ivar Vidfane? A real king, or the shadow of one, created by poets to fill gaps in memory? Perhaps he wore a crown of gold, or maybe he's legend or myth. Yet in the sagas, he's real. He's there, in the words, on the pages, and he wore a crown, even if it was a crown of imagination. He stands as the dream of what the North might be, vast, united, feared by all. And so, whether he walked the earth or strode across parchment only, Ivar became something more lasting than fact. He became the measure of a king and the vision of possibilities. The one who showed what it would look like if the Viking dream of a wide conquest came true. Even though his story doesn't appear until the 12th century, Vikings had a strong oral tradition for passing down tales by firelight. So there's a good chance that both Godfred and Harald heard the story of a king who ruled all the land under one banner and unified a people who would otherwise never shake hands. If that's the case, then Ivar Vidfane is the first king of the Vikings. Not a real flesh and blood king, but the idea that inspired men to reach their full potential. We've just heard about 3 kings, all who can make a case for being the first. They were men who rose from nothing. Men like Godfred, Harald Fairhair, and even this mythic Ivar Vidfane. They remind us that leadership is not born in ease, but in struggle. A spurned word, a mocking glance, a challenge thrown down. These were sparks that lit their fires. When the young woman Gyda told him that she wouldn't marry a petty king, but only a man who ruled all of Norway, he didn't sulk. He didn't shrink back. He made her words the whetstone against which he sharpened his destiny. Her challenge gave him clear vision. And isn't that a mirror for you? We may never wield a sword or a crown, but we all face voices that tell us we're too small, too weak, too broken. The choice is ours, to let those voices bury us or let them build us. To take criticism not as chains, but as sails filled with wind, pushing us further than we dreamed. The sagas are not only about warriors long gone, they are mirrors to show us that we have more potential than we could ever imagine. But without this vision, without seeing the path, without the goal or the purpose, your strength will be limited. Find yourself in these kings and take the next step on your path to reaching your full potential. And until next time, be bold, be strong, and awaken the Viking in you.